The desert sun hammered down on the training grounds at Camp Pendleton with the kind of heat that made mirages dance across the sand. Lieutenant Kira Brennan stood at the edge of the obstacle course, her medical kit slung across her shoulder, watching 200 Marines push their bodies to the breaking point. Sweat soaked through their fatigues as they climbed rope walls, crawled under barbed wire, and sprinted through tire courses that had broken stronger men than them. She checked her watch and made a note on her clipboard. 3 hours into the exercise, and the heat index had climbed past 110 degrees. Dangerous territory. She'd already pulled 2 recruits for heat exhaustion, and the day was only half over. Staff Sergeant Rex Donovan strode past her station without so much as a glance in her direction. He barked orders at a group of struggling recruits, his voice cutting through the afternoon air like a knife. Move faster, push harder, stop acting like children. His words were designed to strip away weakness, to forge something stronger from the raw material of young men who thought they knew what it meant to be a Marine. Before we continue with Kira's story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you have military bases near you or family members who've served. Kira watched Donovan work and said nothing. She'd learned in her first week at this posting that men like him had no use for her observations. To him, she was support staff, a necessary inconvenience, someone who existed to patch up the minor scrapes and sprains that came with turning boys into warriors. Corporal Vincent Thorne emerged from the obstacle course, his face flushed red from exertion and heat. He was young, maybe 22, with the kind of cocky swagger that came from being naturally athletic and never having faced real consequences. He grabbed a water bottle from the station and caught sight of Kira, making notes. "Documenting our suffering, ma'am," he said with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Making sure we're not having too much fun out here." Kira looked up at him with the same calm expression she always wore. "Just monitoring vitals, Corporal, making sure everyone makes it through the day intact." Thorne took a long drink and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Pretty sure we can handle a little desert heat, Lieutenant. We're Marines, not desk jockeys." The comment hung in the air between them. Kira felt the familiar weight of it, the assumption that because she wore medical insignia instead of infantry markers, she'd never seen real action, that her uniform meant something less than his. She'd heard variations of the same sentiment dozens of times since arriving at this base. She simply nodded and returned to her clipboard. Thorne jogged back to join his unit, already laughing with another recruit about something. Probably her. The afternoon stretched on. Kira moved between stations, checking on the Marines who needed water, monitoring those who showed signs of distress. She noticed things others missed. The slight tremor in a recruit's hands. The glassy look in someone's eyes that meant they were pushing past safe limits. The irregular breathing that preceded collapse. At one point, she approached Donovan to suggest they move the afternoon session indoors. The heat was becoming dangerous. He listened to her concern with his arms crossed, his jaw set in a hard line. "These men need to learn to operate in extreme conditions, Lieutenant," he said. "The enemy doesn't stop fighting because it's hot outside." "I understand that, Staff Sergeant, but we've already had 2 heat casualties and the temperature is still climbing. I'm recommending we adjust the schedule." "Your recommendation is noted," he replied, his tone making it clear that noted meant dismissed. Then he turned his back on her and shouted for the next group to begin their run. Kira returned to her station and adjusted her sleeves. They were long despite the heat, covering her arms completely. She preferred it that way. The fabric was soaked with sweat, but she never rolled them up, not even when the other medical personnel stripped down to T-shirts. A young private named Amara Osei approached the medical tent, her face showing concern. She was one of the few female recruits in this training cycle, and Kira had noticed her watching the way the male Marines treated the medical staff. "Ma'am," Osei said quietly, "is Private Chin going to be okay? The one you pulled earlier?" Kira offered a small smile. "He'll be fine, resting in the infirmary with 4 fluids. He'll probably be back tomorrow." Osei nodded but didn't leave. She seemed to want to say something else. Finally she spoke. "How do you deal with it, ma'am? The way they treat you sometimes." Kira considered the question. She could see herself reflected in this young woman, could remember being in her position years ago. The truth was complicated, buried under layers of experience that she couldn't easily share. "You focus on the mission, Private," she said. "Your job is to be the best Marine you can be. Their opinions don't change that." "Yes, ma'am," Osei replied, but Kira could see the doubt in her eyes. The young woman headed back to her unit. The sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon, and the training exercise ground on. Kira watched it all from her post, her medical bag ready, her mind calculating risks and probabilities with the precision of someone who'd done this in far more dangerous circumstances. She noticed everything: the way Donovan pushed his men, the way Thorne led his fire team with more bravado than wisdom, the way the other Marines assumed she'd never understand what they went through. Under her long sleeves, hidden from view, old scars stretched across her skin like a map of battles she never spoke about. And woven among those scars, ink-marked moments that had earned her things these young Marines couldn't imagine. But that was yesterday's war. Today she was just a medical officer they didn't quite respect, standing in the heat, making sure they all made it home alive. The day was far from over, and Kira's instincts, honed in places these recruits had only heard about in briefings, told her something wasn't right about this exercise. She couldn't name it yet, couldn't point to a specific problem. But she learned long ago to trust that feeling in her gut, the one that had kept her alive when everything around her was trying to kill her. She made another note on her clipboard and watched the Marines train, waiting for whatever came next. The training exercise shifted into its next phase as the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains. Kira watched from her medical station as the Marines assembled for the live-fire portion of the day's activities. This was where things got serious, where the margin for error disappeared entirely. Blanks and rubber bullets gave way to real ammunition, and the young men who'd been joking hours earlier now wore expressions of focused intensity. Lieutenant Commander Nathan Cross arrived in a Humvee, dust trailing behind the vehicle as it pulled up near the command post. He was the senior training officer, responsible for coordinating the complex scenarios that would test these Marines under conditions as close to combat as peacetime allowed. Kira had worked with him before and found him professional, competent, one of the few officers who actually listened when she raised safety concerns. Cross stepped out of the vehicle and immediately began conferring with Donovan and the other training staff. Kira couldn't hear their conversation from her position, but she could see Cross gesturing toward the sky, toward the helicopter that would be part of this afternoon's exercise. The CH-53 Sea Stallion sat on the far side of the training grounds, its rotor blades still, waiting for its role in the insertion drill. Donovan's voice carried across the distance as he addressed the assembled Marines. "Listen up. This afternoon, you will be executing a coordinated ground assault with aerial insertion support. First platoon will establish a perimeter while second platoon fast-ropes from the helicopter into the hot zone. You will then secure the objective and extract under simulated enemy fire. This is as real as it gets without someone actually shooting at you, so I expect every one of you to treat it that way." The Marines responded with a unified shout of acknowledgement. Kira watched Thorne among them, saw him checking his weapon, adjusting his gear with the confidence of someone who believed nothing could touch him. He caught her looking and flashed that same cocky grin from earlier, as if to say, "Watch how it's done." She turned away and began preparing her emergency supplies. Live-fire exercises meant elevated risk. Burns from hot brass, minor wounds from ricochets, the occasional broken bone from a bad landing during the fast-rope descent. She'd seen it all before, had treated worse in circumstances these young Marines couldn't fathom. A voice beside her made her turn. Gunnery Sergeant Felix Ortega stood there, a veteran with 23 years of service etched into the lines of his weathered face. He was watching the preparations with the same critical eye Kira had been using. "Something bothering you, Lieutenant?" he asked quietly. Kira hesitated. She'd learned to trust Ortega's judgment in the months she'd been stationed here. Unlike Donovan, he didn't dismiss concerns out of hand. "The timing feels rushed," she said. "They moved the live-fire portion up by 2 hours from the original schedule. Less time for equipment checks, less recovery time for the Marines after that heat exposure." Ortega nodded slowly. Command wants to push them. See how they perform when they're already exhausted. More realistic that way, supposedly. Realistic and dangerous aren't mutually exclusive, Kira replied. No, they're not, Ortega agreed. He studied her for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. You see a lot in your previous posting, Lieutenant. It wasn't really a question, more of an observation. Kira met his gaze and gave the slightest nod. Enough to know when something feels off. Ortega seemed to want to say more, but the moment passed. He returned to his duties, and Kira went back to her preparations, that nagging feeling in her gut growing stronger. The helicopter's engines roared to life across the training grounds. The massive rotors began their slow rotation, gathering speed until they became a blur of motion. Wind whipped across the desert floor, kicking up dust and sand that made everyone squint and turn away. The noise was deafening, a physical presence that drowned out normal conversation. Donovan was shouting orders, but his words were lost in the rotor wash. The first platoon moved into position, spreading out across the designated assault area. They moved with practiced precision, taking cover behind berms and obstacles that simulated an urban combat environment. Blank ammunition began to crackle as the simulated enemy force engaged them. Second platoon, Thorn among them, moved toward the helicopter. They would wait for the signal, then fast-stroke down into the middle of the exercise, adding chaos and complexity to an already demanding scenario. Kira watched them board the aircraft, saw the crew chief checking harnesses and equipment. She noticed something then. A slight shimmy in the helicopter's frame as it lifted off, a vibration that didn't look quite right. It could have been nothing, could have been a trick of the heat distortion or the angle of the sun. But her instincts were screaming now, louder than the turbine engines. Kira grabbed her radio and tried to reach Cross. Lieutenant Commander, I'm seeing an irregularity in the helicopter's flight pattern. Recommend we abort the insertion and run diagnostics. Static crackled back at her. Then Cross's voice, distorted and barely audible over the noise. Say again, Lieutenant. You're breaking up. She repeated her message, more forcefully this time. But even as she spoke, she could see the exercise continuing. The helicopter climbed higher, circling around to make its approach. First platoon was fully engaged in their simulated firefight. The training scenario had its own momentum now, hard to stop once it was in motion. Donovan appeared beside her suddenly, his face flushed with anger. What the hell are you doing, Lieutenant? You don't have authority to call off a live-fire exercise. I'm reporting a safety concern, Staff Sergeant. That helicopter doesn't sound right. He looked at her like she'd lost her mind. That's the sound of a CH-53 under full power. Maybe you'd know that if you'd ever been in a real combat zone instead of sitting in an air-conditioned medical tent. The words hit exactly where he'd intended them to. Kira felt them land, felt the familiar surge of frustration at being dismissed, underestimated, assumed to be less than she was. But she swallowed it down and kept her voice level. I'm telling you something is wrong, she said. Your opinion is noted, Donovan replied, throwing her own words from earlier back at her. Now get back to your station and do your job. Let's do ours. He walked away before she could respond. Kira stood there, her hands clenched around her radio, watching the helicopter complete its circle. It was approaching the insertion point now, loaded with young Marines who trusted that every safety check had been completed, that the officers in charge knew what they were doing. Private Osei appeared at the medical station, assigned to assist with any casualties. She saw the expression on Kira's face, and her own features clouded with concern. Ma'am, is everything all right? She asked. Kira wanted to say no, wanted to grab that radio and demand they ground that aircraft immediately. But she was a lieutenant in a medical role, overruled by training officers who saw her as overcautious at best, incompetent at worst. She had no authority here, just a gut feeling born from experiences she couldn't talk about. Stay alert, Private, she said finally. Keep the trauma supplies ready. The helicopter was directly over the insertion point now, hovering at 100 feet. She could see the crew chief in the open door, see the Marines preparing to rope down into the designated zone. Second platoon was seconds away from beginning their descent. And that's when Kira heard it. A sound that didn't belong, a metallic grinding that cut through even the rotor noise. She looked up and saw what she'd feared, what her instincts had been warning her about all along. Something was very, very wrong with that aircraft. The metallic grinding grew louder, a shriek of torture machinery that cut through the desert air like a warning siren. Kira's eyes locked onto the helicopter as it hovered above the training grounds, watching the way it tilted slightly to the left, overcorrected, then tilted again. The movement was subtle enough that most of the Marines on the ground didn't notice, their attention focused on the simulated firefight erupting around them. But Kira noticed everything. Inside the aircraft, she could see the crew chief's posture change from relaxed readiness to sudden alertness. He was speaking rapidly into his headset, his free hand gripping the edge of the open door. The Marines preparing to fast-stroke down shifted uneasily, sensing something wrong even if they couldn't identify exactly what. Lieutenant Commander Cross's voice crackled over the radio frequency, audible to everyone monitoring the exercise. Viper 1-2, report status. We're seeing irregular flight patterns from your position. The pilot's response came back tense and clipped. Experiencing some vibration in the main rotor assembly, sir. Running diagnostics now. Recommend we abort the insertion and return to base. Relief flooded through Kira. Finally, someone was listening to reason. She watched the helicopter begin to bank away from the insertion point, preparing to head back to the landing zone. The exercise would be delayed, Donovan would be furious, but the Marines would be safe. Then the grinding sound turned into a scream of metal on metal. The helicopter lurched violently to the right. Kira saw one of the Marines in the open door lose his grip and nearly fall, saved only by his safety harness. The aircraft dropped 20 feet in a single sickening moment before the pilot managed to arrest the descent. Black smoke began pouring from somewhere near the engine cowling. Emergency! Emergency! The pilot's voice came over the radio, all calm professionalism stripped away by raw urgency. We have a catastrophic failure in the transmission system. Losing hydraulics. Attempting emergency landing. The training exercise on the ground dissolved into chaos. Marines who'd been focused on their assault scenario now stood frozen, watching the dying aircraft struggle to stay airborne. Donovan was shouting orders, but his voice sounded distant, almost dreamlike, as if the universe had narrowed down to just that helicopter and the young men inside it. Kira was already moving. Her medical bag was across her shoulder, and she was sprinting toward the projected landing zone before her conscious mind had even finished processing the situation. Behind her, she heard Osei calling out, asking what she should do, but Kira didn't slow down to answer. Every second mattered now. The helicopter was descending fast, too fast, the pilot fighting for control with an aircraft that was barely responding. It tilted hard to the left, and Kira's combat-trained mind instantly calculated the trajectory. If it came down at that angle with that much forward momentum, it would roll when it hit the ground. The rotor blades would shear off and become spinning projectiles. Anyone within 50 yards would be in lethal danger. And directly in the projected impact zone, frozen in shock, stood 2 Marines from 1st Platoon who'd been manning a defensive position. One of them was Thorne. Time seemed to slow down in the way it always did when death was close. Kira's vision sharpened, her awareness expanding to take in every detail with crystalline clarity. The 2 Marines stood maybe 40 yards from her current position. The helicopter was 300 feet up and falling fast. She had maybe 15 seconds before impact, possibly less. The rational part of her brain said it was impossible. No one could cover that distance through an obstacle-laden training ground in time to make a difference. The smart move was to take cover herself, to survive and treat the wounded afterward. But Kira had stopped making smart move a long time ago. Her legs pumped harder, eating up the distance in long strides that came from years of forced marches under fire. She vaulted over a training berm without breaking pace, her body moving with a fluid efficiency that came from muscle memory trained in the worst places on Earth. The medical bag bounced against her hip, but she barely felt it. 10 seconds. Thorne finally realized the danger he was in. He looked up at the falling aircraft, his face going white with fear, his body locked in that terrible paralysis that comes when the brain can't process what the eyes are seeing. The Marine next to him, a young private whose name Kira didn't know, had dropped to his knees in shock. 8 seconds. The helicopter was at 100 feet now, and the pilot had lost the battle. The aircraft was falling in a barely controlled spiral, smoke streaming behind it, the rotor blades cutting through the air with a sound like incoming artillery. The crew chief was screaming into the radio, warning everyone to clear the area. 6 seconds. Kira hit the straightaway, the last 20 yards between her and the frozen Marines. Her lungs burned from the sprint and the desert heat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her focus was absolute. She'd done this before, in worse conditions, with more lives on the line. Her body knew what to do, even when her mind said it was impossible. For seconds, she could see Thorne's eyes now, could see the moment he recognized her, the confusion on his face that the medical officer he'd mocked just hours ago was running straight towards certain death. He opened his mouth to shout something, but no sound came out. 2 seconds. Kira reached the Marines with the helicopter at 50 feet and falling. There was no time for finesse, no time for explanations. She grabbed Thorne by his tactical vest with her left hand and the other Marine with her right, and with strength that came from places these young men had never been, she physically hurled both of them away from the impact zone. They flew through the air, their bodies propelled by force that shouldn't have been possible from someone Kira's size. They hit the ground rolling, tumbling away from danger, their momentum carrying them to relative safety behind a concrete barrier. 1 second. Kira tried to follow, but her own momentum was wrong, her angle of escape too narrow. The helicopter was directly above her now, a falling mountain of metal and fuel and spinning death. She could feel the rotor wash pressing down on her, could smell the burning hydraulic fluid, could hear the final scream of the transmission as it tore itself apart. She dove forward, throwing herself flat, covering her head with her arms. The world exploded into noise and heat and flying debris. The helicopter hit the ground 20 feet behind her with an impact that shook the earth like an earthquake. The rotor blades disintegrated, sending shrapnel screaming through the air. The fuselage crumpled and rolled, crushing everything in its path. And then, in the terrible silence that followed the initial impact, Kira heard something that made her blood freeze. Someone was screaming inside the wreckage. The crew chief and pilot were trapped in the twisted metal, and fire was already beginning to spread from the engine compartment. Kira pushed herself to her knees, her ears ringing, her body screaming in protest. She should have been dead. The odds said she should have been crushed or decapitated by rotor fragments. But she was alive, and someone else wasn't going to die if she had anything to say about it. She stood on shaking legs and turned toward the burning helicopter. Behind her, she could hear people shouting, running toward the crash site. But they were too far away, moving too slowly. She was the closest, the only one who could reach the trapped men before the fire consumed them. Kira started walking toward the flames, and something shifted inside her. The quiet, unassuming medical officer who took insults and dismissals with calm professionalism fell away like a discarded uniform. What emerged was something else entirely, something forged in fires hotter than this one, tested in ways that would break most people. She broke into a run toward the inferno, and for the first time since arriving at this base, Lieutenant Kira Brennan was exactly who she'd always been. Heat radiated from the wreckage in waves that distorted the air and made breathing feel like inhaling fire. Kira reached the twisted fuselage and instantly assessed the situation with eyes that had seen too many crashed aircraft in too many war zones. The helicopter had rolled onto its right side, crushing the cockpit area and trapping Lieutenant Commander Cross in a cage of bent metal and shattered instruments. The crew chief, a young sergeant named Marcus Delaney, was pinned beneath a section of bulkhead that had torn loose during the impact. Flames licked up from the engine compartment, feeding on aviation fuel that pooled and spread across the scorched earth. Kira could hear the crackling of fire consuming hydraulic lines and electrical systems, could smell the acrid chemical smoke that meant toxic fumes were mixing with the heat. She had minutes at best before the fuel tanks ruptured and turned the entire crash site into an inferno that would incinerate anyone within 20 yards. "Lieutenant, get away from there," someone shouted from behind her. "The whole thing's going to blow." Kira ignored the warning and climbed onto the wreckage, her boots finding purchase on the buckled metal skin of the aircraft. She could see Cross now, conscious but dazed, blood streaming down his face from a gash across his forehead. His left leg was crushed beneath the control panel, trapped at an angle that made Kira's medical training scream warnings about arterial damage and shock. "Commander, can you hear me?" she called out, her voice cutting through his confusion. Cross focused on her with difficulty, his pupils dilated and uneven. "Brennan, get out of here. Too dangerous." "Not leaving without you, sir," she replied, already pulling a pry bar from her medical bag. She kept unusual equipment in there, tools most medics never carried. Learned from experience that saving lives sometimes meant improvising with whatever was available. She wedged the pry bar into a gap in the crushed cockpit structure and threw her weight against it. The metal groaned, but didn't give. Kira repositioned, finding better leverage, and tried again. This time something shifted, creating a few precious inches of space. It wasn't enough to free Cross, but it was a start. The fire was spreading faster now, crawling along fuel lines toward the main tanks. Kira could hear ammunition cooking off in the cargo area, small arms rounds detonating from the heat with sharp pops that sounded like distant gunfire. Each explosion sent shrapnel pinging against metal, reminded her of sounds she'd spent years trying to forget. Delaney was conscious too, his face twisted in pain, his voice weak when he spoke. "Lieutenant, my legs. I can't feel my legs." "Stay with me, Sergeant," Kira said, dividing her attention between the two trapped men. "Help is coming. Just stay conscious and keep talking to me." She worked the pry bar again, muscles straining, sweat pouring down her face and mixing with soot and smoke residue. The metal resisted, then suddenly gave way with a shriek of tortured steel. Cross gasped as pressure released from his trapped leg. Kira could see the damage now, the compound fracture with bone visible through torn flight suit material. She pushed down the clinical assessment of how bad it was and focused on getting him out. Behind her, she heard heavy boots hitting the ground, multiple people arriving at the crash site. Gunnery Sergeant Ortega appeared at her side, his face grim, carrying a fire extinguisher. "Lieutenant, we need to move fast," he said, already spraying foam toward the advancing flames. "This bird's going to cook off any second." "Help me with Commander Cross," Kira ordered, her voice carrying an authority that made Ortega respond without question. "We need to stabilize his leg before we move him." "No time for that," Ortega argued, but he was already climbing onto the wreckage beside her, reaching for Cross. "Make time," Kira said flatly. "If we move him wrong, he bleeds out before we get him 10 feet. Her hands were already working, pulling medical supplies from her bag with practiced efficiency. She had a tourniquet around Cross's thigh in seconds, tightening it just enough to control the bleeding without cutting off circulation completely. Then she splinted the fractured leg using pieces of the aircraft itself, working faster than Ortega had ever seen a medic move. 2 more Marines arrived, including Private Osei, who carried the backup medical kit. Her eyes were wide with fear, but her hands were steady as she passed supplies to Kira without being asked. The young woman had been paying attention, learning, and now that training was paying off. "On 3, Kira said, positioning herself to support Cross's upper body while Ortega took his legs. 1, 2, 3. They lifted together, extracting Cross from the wreckage with movements that were surprisingly gentle despite the urgency. He cried out once when the broken leg shifted, but then bit down on the pain, his jaw clenched tight. They carried him 20 yards from the helicopter and laid him on the ground, where Osei immediately began checking vital signs. Kira was already turning back toward the wreck. Sergeant Delaney was still trapped, and the fire had reached the cargo area. She could see flames reflected in the pooled fuel, could hear the metal groaning as heat warped the aircraft structure. The main fuel tanks were going to rupture any moment, and when they did, everything within 30 yards would be consumed. "Lieutenant, no." Ortega grabbed her arm. "You can't go back in there." Kira looked at him with eyes that had seen worse odds and beaten them. "Watch me," she said. She pulled free from his grip and sprinted back to the helicopter. The heat was intense now, singing the hair on her arms, making her exposed skin feel like it was burning even before she touched anything. She climbed back onto the wreckage, finding Delaney pinned beneath the collapsed bulkhead section. He looked up at her with gratitude and terror mixed in equal measure. "You came back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course I did," Kira replied, already assessing how to free him. She could see that the bulkhead had him pinned across the chest and abdomen. Moving it wrong could cause internal injuries that would kill him even if they escaped the fire. Moving it too slowly meant they both died when the fuel tanks exploded. She wedged the pry bar beneath the bulkhead and looked Delaney in the eyes. "This is going to hurt. When I lift, you pull yourself out. Don't stop. Don't hesitate. Just move. Understand?" He nodded, gathering himself. Kira positioned herself, finding the angle that would give her maximum leverage. She thought about all the times she'd done impossible things under worse conditions. Thought about the men she'd saved in places whose names were still classified. Thought about the night that had earned her medals she never wore and scars she always covered. She pushed down on the pry bar with everything she had. The bulkhead lifted. Delaney screamed and pulled himself free, his body scraping across jagged metal, leaving blood behind but gaining freedom. Kira held the weight for 3 seconds, 4, 5, giving him time to clear completely. Her arms shook with the strain, her back muscles burning with effort that shouldn't have been possible. Then she dropped the bulkhead and grabbed Delaney under his arms. She dragged him off the wreckage, half carrying and half pulling his weight, moving as fast as her burning legs would allow. Other Marines rushed forward to help, hands reaching out to take Delaney from her. The fuel tanks ruptured with a sound like thunder. A fireball erupted from the helicopter, expanding outward in a wave of superheated air and flame. Kira felt hands grab her, felt herself being pulled backward as the explosion consumed everything she'd just escaped from. The shockwave hit like a physical blow, knocking people off their feet, sending debris flying in all directions. Kira hit the ground hard, her ears ringing, her vision swimming. She rolled on her back and stared up at the desert sky, watching black smoke rise in a column that seemed to reach the clouds. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, tried to process that she was still alive when every logical calculation said she should be dead. Faces appeared above her. Ortega, checking for injuries. Osei, tears streaming down her face. Other Marines whose names she didn't know. All of them looking at her with something that might have been awe. Kira's lungs burned as she dragged air in through a throat raw from smoke and heat. Her body wanted to stay down, wanted to rest, but her training overrode those signals. She forced herself to sit up, then to stand, her legs trembling beneath her, but holding. Around her, the training ground had transformed into a trauma scene that would have overwhelmed most medical personnel. But Kira wasn't most medical personnel. She moved to where Osei was working on Lieutenant Commander Cross, dropped to her knees beside him, and immediately began a systematic assessment. His pulse was rapid and thready, his blood pressure dropping, signs of shock setting in despite the tourniquet. The compound fracture was bleeding again, small arterial spurts that meant they were running out of time. "Osei, pressure here," Kira directed, placing the young private's hands exactly where they needed to be. "Don't let up even for a second. I need to establish in 4-line." Her hands moved with absolute precision, finding a vein in Cross's arm on the first attempt despite his shock and dehydration. She threaded the catheter, secured it, and had fluids running within 30 seconds. Cross's eyes fluttered open and found her face. "You saved my life," he said, his voice weak but clear. "Just doing my job, sir," Kira replied, already moving to check on Sergeant Delaney. Delaney was conscious but fading, his breathing shallow and labored. Kira saw the way he held his chest, recognized the signs of broken ribs and possible lung damage. She placed her hands gently on his torso, feeling for the telltale crepitus of fractured bone, checking for the asymmetry that would indicate a collapsed lung. Delaney looked up at her with eyes that held questions he was too hurt to ask. "How did you move that, bulkhead?" he whispered. "I felt the weight of it. No one person should have been able to lift that." "Adrenaline does strange things," Kira said, but even as she spoke, she knew it was inadequate. She felt her own strength in that moment, had known it was more than just adrenaline, more than just desperate necessity. It was muscle memory from a different life, abilities honed in places where being strong enough meant the difference between soldiers living and dying. More medics arrived with stretchers and additional supplies. Kira coordinated the evacuation with quiet efficiency, prioritizing casualties, directing treatment, making sure no one was overlooked. She was in her element now. The chaos and crisis, something she could navigate with absolute confidence. Staff Sergeant Donovan appeared through the smoke, his face streaked with soot, his expression unreadable. He watched Kira work for a long moment, watched the way the other medics deferred to her judgment, the way even Ortega followed her instructions without question. "Lieutenant Brennan," he said finally, his voice lacking its usual edge of condescension. Kira looked up from securing Delaney to the stretcher. "Staff Sergeant." Donovan seemed to struggle with what to say next. His jaw worked as if the words were difficult to form. "That was," he started then stopped. "I've never seen anything like what you just did." "2 men are alive because of it," Kira replied simply. "That's all that matters." She turned back to her work, dismissing him, but Donovan didn't leave. He stood there watching as she checked and rechecked her patients, as she made sure every detail was handled correctly. When the medevac helicopter arrived, when Cross and Delaney were loaded aboard and lifted away toward the base hospital, Donovan was still standing there. Corporal Thorne approached, moving slowly, his face pale beneath its coating of dust and sweat. His tactical vest was torn where Kira had grabbed him, thrown him clear of the impact zone. He stopped a respectful distance away, waiting for her attention. Kira stood and faced him, saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Respect, maybe, or the beginning of understanding that his assumptions about her had been catastrophically wrong. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was different now, stripped of its earlier cockiness. "I wanted to thank you for what you did. You saved my life and Private Morrison's. We'd be dead if you hadn't reached us in time. You would have done the same for your fellow Marines," Kira said. "No, ma'am," Thorne replied, shaking his head. "I was frozen. Couldn't move, couldn't think. I've never been that scared in my life." He paused, struggling with the admission. "You ran toward it, towards certain death. How do you do that?" Kira was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. The truth was complicated, buried under years of missions she couldn't discuss and experiences that had fundamentally changed who she was. But she could give him something. "You do it because someone has to," she said finally. "Because the alternative is watching good people die when you might have been able to stop it. Fear doesn't go away, Corporal. You just learn to act anyway." Thorne nodded slowly, processing this. Then he did something Kira hadn't expected. He came to attention and saluted her with parade ground precision, holding it until she returned it. When he walked away, his bearing had changed. The swagger was gone, replaced by something deeper. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the devastated training ground. Emergency vehicles had arrived, fire crews working to contain what remained of the burning helicopter. The Marines who'd been part of the exercise stood in small groups, talking in low voices, their eyes constantly drifting to where Kira stood. Gunnery Sergeant Ortega approached with a blanket and a bottle of water. He draped the blanket over her shoulders even though the desert evening was still warm, and pressed the water into her hands. "Drink," he ordered gently. Kira obeyed, suddenly aware of how parched she was. The water tasted like the best thing she'd ever had, cool and clean after breathing smoke and dust. Ortega studied her with those knowing eyes. 23 years I've been a Marine, he said. Served in 3 wars, seen more combat than most people can imagine. And I have never, not once, seen anyone do what you just did. Kira met his gaze, but said nothing. That speed, he continued. That strength. The way you moved, the way you knew exactly what to do without hesitation. That's not standard medical training, Lieutenant. That's combat experience. Real combat, the kind that changes you. Staff Sergeant, I don't. Kira started, but Ortega held up a hand. I'm not asking you to explain, he said. Whatever you did before you came here, wherever you served, that's your business. But those kids, he gestured toward the assembled Marines. They saw something today that they'll never forget. You can't go back to being underestimated after this. Kira pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt. She'd spent months maintaining a low profile, accepting the disrespect, letting people underestimate her, because it was easier than explaining why a decorated combat veteran was working as a base medical officer instead of leading special operations teams. I just want to do my job, she said quietly. I know, Ortega replied, but sometimes the job finds you anyway. He was right, and Kira knew it. Something had shifted today. Some barrier had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. The quiet, unassuming medical officer who took insults with calm professionalism was gone, burned away in the same fire that had consumed the helicopter. Private Osei approached hesitantly, carrying Kira's medical bag. It was scorched and battered, the fabric charred in places but intact. She held it out with both hands like an offering. Ma'am, I thought you want this, Osei said. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady. What you did today, what you showed us. I've never seen courage like that. Never. Kira took the bag and managed a tired smile. You did well today, Private. Your assistance with Commander Cross made all the difference. I just followed what you taught me, Osei said. But you were incredible. The young woman walked away, and Kira stood alone for a moment in the gathering dusk. Her body was beginning to register the toll of what she'd done, muscles screaming in protest, burns and bruises making themselves known. But she was still standing, still functional, because that's what years of pushing past human limits had taught her to do. She looked down at her arms and realized her sleeves had been torn during the rescue, exposing several inches of scarred skin. In the fading light, she could see the edge of ink beneath the scars, the beginning of markings that told stories she'd never wanted to share. Kira pulled the blanket tighter, using it to cover the exposed skin on her arms. The movement was instinctive, protective, but several Marines had already noticed. She could see them looking, could see the questions forming behind their eyes. Questions she wasn't ready to answer. Questions that would unravel the careful anonymity she'd built around herself. The base commander's Humvee arrived in a cloud of dust, and Colonel Harrison Webb stepped out before the vehicle had fully stopped. He was a tall man with iron-gray hair and a bearing that commanded immediate respect. Webb had been in special operations for 15 years before taking this command position, and his reputation was legendary among those who knew the classified world. His eyes swept the scene, taking in the destroyed helicopter, the assembled Marines, and finally settling on Kira. Something flickered across his face, recognition maybe, or surprise. He approached her with purposeful strides, while his aide began coordinating with the emergency response teams. Lieutenant Brennan, Webb said, his voice carrying the weight of command. I need a full report on casualties and the sequence of events. Kira straightened despite her exhaustion, the military protocol overriding everything else. Yes, sir. 2 casualties extracted from the wreckage. Lieutenant Commander Cross with compound fracture of the left femur. Possible internal injuries, stable condition when medevaced. Sergeant Delaney with multiple rib fractures, possible pneumothorax, also stable. Both en route to base hospital. Additionally, 2 Marines from 1st Platoon pulled clear of the impact zone prior to crash. Minor injuries treated on site. Webb listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving her face. "In your assessment of what caused the helicopter failure, initial observation suggested transmission malfunction, sir. The metallic grinding sound and loss of hydraulic pressure were consistent with catastrophic mechanical failure. Full investigation will determine root cause." Webb nodded slowly. "I understand you entered the burning wreckage twice to extract the trapped personnel." "Yes, sir. Under conditions that the fire safety officer tells me should have been instantly fatal. Through heat intense enough to warp steel, while ammunition was cooking off inside the aircraft. The situation required immediate action, sir," Kira replied. "Waiting for fire suppression would have cost lives." Webb studied her for a long moment, and Kira had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing far more than she wanted visible. His next words confirmed it. "Lieutenant, your personnel file indicates you transferred here 8 months ago from Walter Reed Medical Center. Administrative duty following a routine deployment. Is that correct?" "That's correct, sir," Kira said, but her voice had lost some of its steadiness. "Interesting," Webb said, "because what I witnessed today and what these Marines are describing suggests capabilities far beyond what one would expect from someone with an administrative background. The speed, the strength, the tactical decision-making under extreme pressure. That's not standard medical training, Lieutenant." Kira felt the trap closing around her. She could deflect, could cite adrenaline and training, could maintain the fiction. But Webb's eyes told her he already knew, or at least suspected. Men like him had access to files that went deeper than the sanitized versions most people saw. "With respect, sir, I prefer not to discuss my previous assignments," she said carefully. "I'm sure you would," Webb replied. "But given what happened here today, I think that discussion is unavoidable. However, it can wait until after you've been medically evaluated." He gestured to one of the medics who'd arrived with the emergency teams. "This corpsman will check you for injuries." "That's an order, Lieutenant. You're no good to anyone if you collapse from smoke inhalation or untreated burns." Kira wanted to argue, but recognized the futility. "Yes, sir," she said. The corpsman, a young man named Peters, approached with obvious nervousness. "Ma'am, if you could come sit in the ambulance, I'll do a quick assessment." Kira followed him to the vehicle, aware of every eye tracking her movement. She sat on the rear bumper while Peters pulled out his diagnostic equipment. His hands shook slightly as he checked her blood oxygen levels and listened to her lungs. "You're the one who pulled Commander Cross out," he said as he worked. "Everyone's talking about it, saying you lifted wreckage that would take 3 men to move." "People exaggerate in crisis situations," Kira said. "Maybe," Peters replied, but he didn't sound convinced. "Ma'am, I need to check for burns. Your sleeves are damaged, and I can see some exposed skin. If you could remove the blanket." Kira hesitated, her hand tightening on the fabric. "It's fine, just some minor scorching." "Ma'am, with respect, I need to verify that. Burns can be serious even when they don't feel that way initially." Peters was insistent now, his medical training overriding his nervousness. She knew he was right, knew she couldn't refuse a medical evaluation without raising more questions. Slowly, reluctantly, she let the blanket fall away from her shoulders and arms. Peters went very still. The torn sleeves revealed skin marked by scars, dozens of them, crisscrossing her forearms and biceps in patterns that spoke of violence and survival. Shrapnel scars from explosions, burns from fire and chemicals, the distinctive marks of bullets that had come too close. But woven among the scars, visible in the fading light, were tattoos. Not decorative tattoos, not art for art's sake. Each marking was precise, military in its simplicity. Numbers and coordinates, dates that meant something, and symbols that anyone with special operations experience would recognize instantly. Peters tried to maintain his professional composure, but his voice betrayed his shock. "Ma'am, these scars, they're combat-related. Multiple deployments worth. Old injuries," Kira said tersely. "They don't affect my current fitness for duty." "And the tattoos?" Peters continued, leaning closer to examine them. "These coordinates, I recognize this format. These are mission markers. Special operations mission markers." Before Kira could respond, Before she could deflect or redirect, Gunnery Sergeant Ortega appeared beside the ambulance. He looked at the exposed scars and tattoos, and his weathered face showed no surprise, just a slow nod of confirmation, as if something he'd suspected had been proven true. "Stand down, corpseman," Ortega said quietly. "The lieutenant doesn't need an audience for her medical evaluation." "But, Gunny, these markings," Peter started, "are none of your damn business." Ortega cut him off. "Check her vitals, treat any injuries, and keep your observations to yourself. That's an order." Peter swallowed hard. "Yes, Gunny." He completed his examination quickly, checking for burns and finding mostly superficial damage. Kira's skin was red and tender in places, but nothing that wouldn't heal. He applied some burn cream and bandaged a few spots where the heat had been most intense. "You should rest, ma'am," Peters said as he finished. "Your body's been through significant trauma. The adrenaline crash is going to hit hard." "I'll rest when everyone else is taken care of," Kira replied. She stood, pulling what remained of her sleeves down as far as they would go, but the damage was done. Several Marines had seen, and in a military community, word would spread faster than the fire that had consumed the helicopter. She looked around and caught sight of Thorne standing with a group of other young Marines, all of them staring in her direction, their expressions a mixture of awe and confusion. Private Osei approached carrying a clean uniform jacket. "Ma'am, I thought you might want this," she said softly, holding it out. Kira took it gratefully and pulled it on, covering the exposed scars and tattoos. "Thank you, Private." "Ma'am, if I may ask," Osei said hesitantly, "those coordinates on your arm. I recognized one of them from a briefing we had last month about special operations missions in Kandahar province. There was this legendary mission where a combat medic saved nearly 50 men in a single night. They called her the Angel of Kandahar." Osei's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "That was you, wasn't it?" Kira looked at the young woman, saw the hope and admiration in her eyes, saw herself reflected there from years ago when she'd been just as young and idealistic. She could deny it, could shut down the conversation. But something in Osei's face made her tired of hiding. "That was a different life, Private," Kira said quietly. "A different person." "No, ma'am," Osei replied with absolute certainty. "That was you. It's always been you. We just didn't see it." The desert evening had turned cold, the way it always did once the sun disappeared. Kira stood in the gathering darkness, surrounded by Marines who were beginning to understand that the quiet medical officer they dismissed and disrespected was something else entirely. Someone whose scars told stories of heroism they couldn't imagine, whose tattoos marked achievements they could only aspire to reach. Colonel Webb was conferring with Staff Sergeant Donovan and the other training officers. Even from a distance, Kira could see Donovan's body language had changed. The aggressive certainty was gone, replaced by something that looked like shame. He kept glancing in her direction, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. The secret she'd kept for 8 months was unraveling with every passing minute, and Kira felt the weight of it like physical pressure. She'd come to this base to escape her past, to find some kind of peace in routine medical duty far from combat zones. But the past had a way of finding you, especially when you did something impossible, and 200 Marines witnessed it. The base hospital was sterile and bright, a stark contrast to the smoke and chaos Kira had left behind on the training grounds. She'd been ordered to report for a full medical evaluation, and this time there was no room for argument. Colonel Webb had made it clear that it wasn't a request. She sat on an examination table in a private room, still wearing the borrowed uniform jacket despite the warmth inside the building. A senior medical officer, Captain Angela Reeves, was reviewing Kira's vital signs with a concerned expression that suggested she was seeing more than just numbers on a monitor. "Your blood pressure is elevated, heart rate still racing," Reeves said. "That's expected given what you went through, but I'm also seeing indicators of extreme physical exertion beyond what the rescue alone would account for. Lieutenant, I need you to be honest with me. Are you experiencing any chest pain, difficulty breathing, unusual fatigue?" "Nothing beyond what's normal after hauling 2 men out of a burning aircraft," Kira replied. Reeves set down her tablet and looked directly at her. I've been a military physician for 18 years. I know the difference between standard stress responses and something deeper. Your body is showing signs of someone who regularly pushes far beyond normal human limits. The muscle development, the cardiovascular efficiency, the pain tolerance. This isn't recreational fitness, Lieutenant. This is combat conditioning maintained at an elite level. Kira said nothing, her jaw set in a hard line. I'm also noticing significant scarring, Reeves continued gently. Would you be willing to let me examine the full extent of your injuries? For medical purposes only. Whatever I see stays between us under doctor-patient confidentiality. It was the confidentiality promise that made Kira relent. Slowly, she removed the borrowed jacket and then the torn shirt beneath it. The overhead lights revealed what the desert twilight had only hinted at. Her arms, shoulders, and upper back were covered in scars. A roadmap of violence survived. Burns, shrapnel wounds, surgical scars from field operations performed under fire. And the tattoos. Reeves drew in a sharp breath. The markings were intricate and purposeful, each one telling a story to those who knew how to read them. Bronze star coordinates ran down Kira's right forearm. Purple heart dates circled her left bicep and centered between her shoulder blades. Partially visible above the tank top she wore was a silver star symbol with coordinates beneath it that anyone with special operations clearance would recognize. Kandahar Province, Reeves whispered, reading the numbers. October 13th. That was the night of the compound siege, when a single combat medic held off an enemy assault while treating 47 wounded soldiers. Reeves looked up at Kira with dawning comprehension. The Angel of Kandahar. That story's taught in combat medicine courses as an example of heroism under impossible odds. But they never released your name. The reports kept you anonymous for operational security reasons. That was the idea, Kira said quietly. So I could have a life after that night, instead of being defined by it forever. Reeves nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what she'd been told. These other coordinates, she said, tracing her finger near but not touching the tattoos. Each one is a mission, isn't it? Each one represents lives saved under combat conditions. 53 missions over 6 years, Kira confirmed. 312 soldiers who made it home because someone was there when they needed help. She paused, her voice dropping. And 14 who didn't make it despite everything I tried. Captain Reeves stepped back and began making notes on her tablet. But her movements were different now. Less clinical, more reverent. Your physical condition is remarkable given your history, she said. Most people with this level of trauma would have significant mobility limitations, chronic pain issues. But you're still operating at peak capacity. The body remembers what it needs to survive, Kira said. You train it long enough, push it hard enough, and it adapts. There was a knock on the door, and Colonel Webb entered without waiting for permission. He glanced at Captain Reeves, who gave him a subtle nod, confirming what he'd already suspected. His expression was grave, but respectful. Captain, give us the room, please, Webb ordered. Reeves gathered her equipment and left, closing the door behind her. Webb pulled up a chair and sat down heavily, suddenly looking everyone as 53 years. He was quiet for a long moment, studying Kira with eyes that had seen too much war to be shocked by anything anymore. Lieutenant Kira Brennan, he said finally. Formerly Sergeant First Class Brennan, Special Operations Combat Medic, attached to Delta Force Operational Units for 6 years. 3 Silver Stars, 5 Bronze Stars, 7 Purple Hearts, and a Medal of Honor nomination that you personally request to be withdrawn. Retired from active special operations 18 months ago after the Kandahar mission left you with severe PTSD, recommissioned as a lieutenant in standard medical services as part of your recovery protocol. Kira pulled her shirt back on slowly, covering the evidence of her past. That's all my classified files, sir, which you apparently have access to. I made some calls after what I witnessed today, Webb admitted. Your surface file lists you as having administrative experience and standard deployment history. But men don't move the way you move today without serious combat training. Women don't display that kind of tactical awareness without having lived through hell and learned from it. He leaned forward. Why didn't you tell anyone? Why hide what you are? Because what I am is tired, sir, Kira said, and for the first time her voice cracked with emotion. I spent 6 years watching the best soldiers in the world bleed out of my hands. Spent 6 years making impossible choices about who lived and who died. Spent 6 years being afraid every single day that I wouldn't be fast enough, strong enough, good enough to save them. She took a shaky breath. Kandahar broke something in me, sir. After that night, I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't be that person anymore. I needed normal. I needed quiet. I needed to not be the angel of Kandahar. Webb's expression softened with understanding. So you requested a transfer to the most routine, boring medical posting you could find. A training base where the worst injuries are usually sprained ankles and heat exhaustion. Yes, sir. And then today happened. Yes, sir, Kira repeated. Today happened, and now everyone knows, and tomorrow I'll be right back where I started. The legend instead of the person. The story instead of the soldier. Webb stood and walked to the window, looking out the base spread below them. The destroyed helicopter was still visible in the distance, emergency lights still flashing around it. You saved 2 lives today, Lieutenant. Probably saved a dozen more with your quick actions. You demonstrated courage and capability that inspired every Marine who witnessed it. He turned back to face her. That's not something to hide from or be ashamed of. I'm not ashamed, Sir, Kira said. I'm exhausted. The two of them stood in silence, the weight of shared understanding hanging between them. Webb had been in special operations long enough to know what it cost, to understand the toll that kind of service extracted from even the strongest people. What happens now? Kira asked finally. Now, Webb said, you go back to your quarters and rest. Tomorrow we'll deal with the questions and the attention. I'll run interference where I can. Keep the story contained as much as possible. But Kira, and I'm using your first name deliberately, you can't unring this bell. Those Marines saw what you're capable of. They know now that they've been disrespecting someone who's done more for this Corps than most of them will achieve in their entire careers. I never wanted their respect based on my past, she said. I wanted to earn it through my present. You did both today, Webb replied. And there's no shame in that. After Webb left, Kira sat alone in the examination room for a long time. Through the window, she could see Marines moving across the base, going about their duties, living their lives. Somewhere out there, Thorne was probably telling his story to anyone who would listen. Osei was likely processing what she'd learned about the woman she'd been assisting. Donovan was maybe finally understanding the magnitude of his assumptions. And somewhere in a classified file that few people had clearance to read, there was a detailed account of a night in Kandahar when a combat medic had held a defensive position for 7 hours, treating wounded soldiers while returning fire against overwhelming enemy forces, refusing evacuation until every last man under her care was safely extracted. A night that had earned her the nation's highest honors and nearly destroyed her in the process. Kira looked down at her arms, at the scars and tattoos she'd kept hidden for so long. In the harsh hospital lighting, they seemed to tell their stories more loudly, more insistently. Stories of battles fought and won, of soldiers saved and lost, of a woman who'd been forged in fire and proven herself over and over in the worst circumstances imaginable. She'd wanted to leave that woman behind, to find peace in anonymity and routine. But maybe, Kira thought, as she stood and prepared to face whatever came next, maybe that woman had never really left. Maybe she'd just been waiting for the moment when she'd be needed again. Kira returned to her quarters as the base settled into its evening rhythm. The small room was exactly as she'd left it that morning, Spartan and functional, revealing nothing about the person who lived there. No photographs on the walls, no personal items on display, just the bare essentials of military life. It was the room of someone who didn't want to put down roots, who was always prepared to leave at a moment's notice. She sat on the edge of her bunk and felt the adrenaline crash that Corpsman Peters had warned about. Her hands began to shake, a fine tremor that spread up her arms and into her core. It always happened like this after combat, after those moments when her body had operated beyond normal human capacity and her mind had made split-second calculations between life and death. The shaking wasn't fear, not exactly. It was the price of pushing so hard, the body's way of releasing tension that couldn't be sustained. Kira pulled off her boots and lay back on the bunk, staring at the ceiling. Images from the day played behind her closed eyelids. The helicopter falling, the two Marines frozen in terror, the impact that should have killed her. Cross trapped in the wreckage, Delaney pinned beneath steel, the flames crawling closer with every second. She'd done impossible things today, and her body knew it, and now it was demanding payment. Sleep wouldn't come easily. It never did after days like this. A soft knock on her door pulled her back from the edge of dark memories. She sat up, pulled her boots back on, and opened the door to find Gunnery Sergeant Ortega standing in the hallway. He held 2 cups of coffee, steam rising from both. "Figured you could use this," he said, offering her one. "Black, no sugar. That's how you take it, right?" "How did you know that?" Kira asked, accepting the cup. 23 years teaches you to notice things," Ortega replied. "Can I come in, or would you rather I leave you alone?" Kira stepped aside, and Ortega entered, settling into the room's single chair while she returned to her bunk. They drank their coffee in comfortable silence for a moment. 2 veterans who understood that sometimes words weren't necessary. "The whole base is talking," Ortega said finally. "Stories spreading faster than I've ever seen. By morning, every Marine station here will know who you are. What you did in Kandahar. The missions before that. All of it." "I figured as much," Kira said quietly. "Thorne's been telling anyone who'll listen that you threw him and Morrison clear of that crash like they weighed nothing. Says he saw you lift wreckage that should have taken a crew with hydraulic equipment." The kid's half terrified, half in awe. "Adrenaline makes you stronger than you think you are," Kira said, but even she knew the explanation was wearing thin. "Maybe," Ortega allowed. "Or maybe you've spent 6 years learning to do impossible things because soldiers' lives depended on it. Maybe you've trained your body and mind to operate at levels most people can't imagine because anything less meant watching good people die." Kira looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. "You've been thinking about this a lot." "Since the moment I saw you move today," Ortega confirmed. "I served with special operations units twice in my career. Saw what those men and women were capable of when everything was on the line. You move like they did, like someone who's been tested in ways that change you fundamentally." He set down his coffee and leaned forward, his expression serious. "There's something you should know. Staff Sergeant Donovan came to find me about an hour ago. He wanted to talk about you, about the things he'd said, the way he'd treated you since you arrived." Kira felt a knot form in her stomach. "And what did he say?" "He's ashamed," Ortega said bluntly. "Really, genuinely ashamed. Said he spent months dismissing you, making comments about desk medics and people who'd never seen real action. And all that time, you were someone who'd done more, seen more, survived more than he ever has." He paused. "Donovan's a good Marine, but he's got blind spots. Today you showed him the biggest one." "I never wanted to make anyone feel ashamed," Kira said. "I know," Ortega replied. "But maybe some people needed to feel it. Maybe some of us needed to be reminded that we don't know everyone's story, that the quiet person doing their job might have depths we can't imagine." There was another knock, more hesitant this time. Kira opened the door to find Private Osei standing there, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to check if you needed anything." Osei's voice was soft, uncertain. "And I wanted to tell you that what you did today, it changed something for me." "Come in, Private," Kira said, and Osei entered, her eyes widening slightly at seeing Gunnery Sergeant Ortega there. "Change what?" Kira asked gently. Osei struggled to find the words. "I've been in training for 4 months now, and every day I've had to deal with comments about being female in a male-dominated field. Had to prove myself over and over, had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. And I've watched you deal with the same thing, watched how you handled the disrespect with patience and professionalism." She took a breath. "But today I learned that the whole time, you were someone who'd already proven yourself beyond anything these recruits will ever achieve. You could have shut down every dismissive comment with your record, with your medals, with your reputation. But you didn't. You just kept doing your job. She paused. Why? Kira considered the question carefully. Because proving yourself never stops, Private. The moment you start relying on past achievements to demand respect, you stop earning new respect through present actions. I wanted to be valued for what I was doing here, not for what I did in Kandahar. And now, Osei asked. Now everyone knows anyway, Kira said with a slight smile. So I suppose we'll see what happens next. What happens next, Ortega said, standing, is that you have the respect of every Marine on this base. Not because of your past, but because of what they witnessed today. You saved lives, Lieutenant. That's all any of us can aspire to do. He moved toward the door, then paused. Get some rest. Colonel Webb wants to see you at Ohidehunter tomorrow. There's going to be questions from higher up, maybe a formal inquiry into the helicopter failure. You'll need to give statements, probably multiple times. After Ortega left, Osei lingered for a moment. Ma'am, can I ask you something personal? You can ask, Kira said. I might not answer. The coordinates tattooed on your arm, the ones from Kandahar. Do you ever regret that night? Regret what it cost you? Kira was quiet for a long moment. I regret that it was necessary, she said finally. I regret that 47 soldiers were in a position where they needed someone to do what I did. But I don't regret doing it. Given the same circumstances, I'd make the same choices. Even knowing what it would do to you, Osei pressed. Especially knowing that, Kira replied. Because those men are alive. They went home to their families. They get to have lives and futures. That's worth any price I had to pay. Osei nodded slowly, absorbing this. Thank you, ma'am, for today, and for showing me what real strength looks like. After the young private left, Kira was alone again with her thoughts and the cooling coffee. She stood and went to the small mirror mounted on the wall, studying her reflection. The woman looking back at her was tired, marked by fire and smoke, but still standing. Still here. She rolled up her sleeves deliberately, looking at the scars and tattoos in the harsh fluorescent light. For 8 months, she'd hidden these marks, treated them like shameful secrets instead of what they really were. Proof of survival, evidence of service, a record of every time she'd chosen to run toward danger instead of away from it. Tomorrow, everyone would know. Tomorrow, the whispers and questions would start. Tomorrow, she'd have to face a base full of Marines who saw her differently, who knew her story, who would either put her on a pedestal or treat her like fragile broken glass. But tonight, in this quiet moment, Kira allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not in the medals or the recognition, but in the simple fact that when the moment came, when lives were on the line, her body and mind had remembered what to do. The skills hadn't atrophied. The courage hadn't faded. The angel of Kandahar had been sleeping, not dead. And maybe, Kira thought, as she finally lay down to rest, maybe that wasn't something to hide from after all. Morning came too early, sunlight streaming through the window and pulling Kira from restless sleep filled with dreams of fire and falling aircraft. She'd managed maybe 3 hours of actual rest, the remainder of the night spent in that twilight state between waking and sleeping where the mind replays events endlessly, searching for what could have been done differently. She dressed in a fresh uniform, taking care with her appearance in a way she hadn't bothered with for months. Today would bring scrutiny, questions, attention she'd spent 8 months avoiding. She might as well look squared away when facing it. The walk to the mess hall revealed just how thoroughly the story had spread. Marines she passed didn't just look at her. They stopped what they were doing and stared. Some nodded with obvious respect. Others seemed unable to meet her eyes, perhaps embarrassed by their own past behavior. A few younger recruits actually stepped aside to let her pass, treating her with deference usually reserved for senior officers. Inside the mess hall, conversation died when she entered. 200 Marines eating breakfast went silent in a wave that spread from the entrance to the far corners of the room. Kira felt every eye on her as she moved toward the serving line, felt the weight of sudden recognition and all that came with it. Then someone started clapping. It was Corporal Thorne, standing at his table, his hands coming together in steady, deliberate applause. Within seconds, others joined. Then more. Then the entire mess hall was on its feet. applauding, the sound echoing off the walls like thunder. Some of the Marines weren't just clapping, they were saluting, holding perfect attention even with plates of food cooling in front of them. Kira stood frozen, her throat tight, unsure how to respond to this display. She'd never wanted this, never sought recognition or glory. But here it was anyway, unavoidable and overwhelming. Gunnery Sergeant Ortega appeared at her elbow. "Accept it with grace, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "They need to do this." She nodded once, acknowledging the assembled Marines with a slight inclination of her head, then moved quickly to get her food and find a seat. The applause faded, but the atmosphere remained charged, electric with awareness of her presence. Staff Sergeant Donovan approached her table hesitantly, his usual swagger completely absent. He stood at a respectful distance, his posture stiff with discomfort. "Lieutenant Brennan," he said formally, "may I have a word?" Kira gestured to the empty seat across from her. "Sit down, Staff Sergeant." Donovan sat, but seemed unable to look directly at her. He stared at his hands instead, clenched on the table surface. "I owe you an apology, ma'am. A significant one. For months, I treated you with disrespect, made assumptions about your experience and capabilities based on nothing but my own prejudice. Yesterday, when you tried to warn me about the helicopter, I dismissed your concerns as," he paused, struggling with the words, "as nervous female instinct. Those are my exact words. I remember," Kira said quietly. "You were right, and I was wrong," Donovan continued. "And because I didn't listen, Commander Cross and Sergeant Delaney came within minutes of dying." He finally looked up at her. "I've been a Marine for 15 years. Thought I knew what courage looked like. Then I watched you run toward a falling aircraft to save 2 men who'd done nothing to earn your sacrifice. Men who'd probably laughed at jokes made at your expense. Thorne and Morrison didn't deserve to die for being young and stupid," Kira said. "Nobody does." "Still," Donovan said, "what you did, what you've done throughout your career, it puts the rest of us to shame. I wanted you to know that I understand that now. And I'm sorry it took watching you nearly die to learn it." "Apology accepted, Staff Sergeant," Kira replied. "Now let's move forward and make sure that helicopter failure leads to better safety protocols so it never happens again." Donovan nodded and stood, relief visible on his weathered face. "Thank you, ma'am. And for what it's worth, I'm glad you're stationed here. This base is better for having you, regardless of what I thought before." After he left, Private Osei slid into the vacated seat. The young woman's eyes were bright with excitement barely contained. "Ma'am, have you heard what they're saying?" Osei asked, keeping her voice low. "I've heard a lot of things," Kira replied. "You'll have to be more specific. They're saying Colonel Webb is recommending you for another Silver Star for yesterday's rescue. And there's talk about you being reassigned to a special operations training role, teaching combat medicine to elite units." Kira felt her stomach drop. "That's exactly what I don't want," she said. Osei looked confused. "But ma'am, that's an incredible honor. Most people would," she trailed off, seeing Kira's expression. "Most people didn't spend 6 years watching friends die in special operations zones," Kira said gently. "Most people didn't retire from that world because it broke something inside them. I came here to heal, Private, not to go back." Understanding dawned on Osei's face. "Imsori, Mung. I didn't think about it that way." At 0800, Kira reported to Colonel Webb's office as ordered. She found him behind his desk with several senior officers she didn't recognize, all wearing uniforms that indicated they'd come from higher headquarters. This wasn't going to be a casual debrief. "Lieutenant Brennan, reporting as ordered, sir," she said, standing at attention. "At ease," Lieutenant Webb replied. "These are representatives from Division Command and the Special Operations Command. They're here to discuss both yesterday's incident and your future assignment." A 1-star general she didn't recognize spoke first. "Lieutenant Brennan, your actions yesterday were extraordinary by any measure. You saved multiple lives under conditions that would have killed most people. Your service record, now that we've had time to review it properly, is remarkable. 3 Silver Stars, 5 Bronze Stars, 7 Purple Hearts across 53 Special Operations missions." "Yes, sir," Kira replied carefully. SOCM wants you back, the general said bluntly. They want you training the next generation of combat medics, teaching them the skills and decision-making that made you legendary in the special operations community. With respect, sir, I retired from special operations duty, Kira said. I'm not looking to return to that world. The general leaned forward. Yesterday suggests otherwise, Lieutenant. When crisis struck, you responded with the full capability of your special operations training. That's not something that just goes away. Colonel Webb interjected smoothly. General, if I may, Lieutenant Brennan came to this base specifically to step away from high-intensity operations. What happened yesterday was an emergency response, not a request to return to active special operations status. Another officer, a colonel with Special Forces tabs, spoke up. Lieutenant, I understand the toll that service takes. I've seen it in too many good soldiers. But I've also seen what happens when we lose institutional knowledge because veterans like you want to disappear into routine assignments. The skills you have, the experience you carry, it's too valuable to waste on basic training medical support. It's not wasted if it means I'm still serving and still sane, Kira replied, her voice firmer now. I gave 6 years to special operations. I gave everything I had. And after Kandahar, I had nothing left to give. Coming here wasn't running away, it was survival. The room fell silent at her directness. The officers exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, others understanding. Webb spoke again. Gentlemen, perhaps we could table this discussion for now. Lieutenant Brennan has been through a traumatic experience and deserves time to recover before we make any decisions about her future assignment. The general nodded slowly. Agreed. But Lieutenant, this conversation isn't over. Your country invested heavily in your training, in making you one of the best combat medics in military history. We can't simply let that walk away. After the officers left, Kira remained standing in Webb's office, feeling the walls closing in. This was what she'd feared, what she'd known would happen if her past was revealed. The military didn't let go of assets easily, didn't accept that sometimes the best soldiers were the ones too broken to soldier anymore. Sit down, Kira, Webb said quietly, and the use of her first name told her this was off the record now. She sat, suddenly exhausted despite the early hour. I bought you some time, Webb said, but they're right about one thing. You can't hide what you are anymore. Every Marine on this base knows now. By tomorrow, every military installation in the country will have heard the story of the Angel of Kandahar, saving 2 more lives. Kira closed her eyes. I just want to do my job, sir. Help people. Stay off the radar. I know, Webb replied, but sometimes fate has other plans. The afternoon brought news from the base hospital that changed everything. Lieutenant Commander Cross had requested to see Kira, and according to Captain Reeves, he was insisting with the kind of determination that suggested he wouldn't rest until his request was granted. Kira arrived at the hospital to find Cross sitting up at his bed, his leg elevated and wrapped in a complex system of braces and supports. His face was still bruised from the crash, but his eyes were clear and focused. When he saw her enter, something shifted in his expression, a mixture of gratitude and purpose. Lieutenant Brennan, he said, gesturing to the chair beside his bed. Thank you for coming. I know you've had a difficult couple of days. How are you feeling, sir? Kira asked, settling into the chair. Alive, thanks to you, Cross replied. The doctors tell me I'll make a full recovery. 6 months of physical therapy, but I'll be back to full duty. Delaney's doing well, too. They're monitoring him for internal injuries, but he's stable. I'm glad to hear it, Kira said. Cross was quiet for a moment, studying her face. I remember everything, you know? Every second of being trapped in that wreckage. I remember you climbing onto burning metal to reach me. I remember watching you work with a precision and efficiency I've never seen outside of combat zone field hospitals. And I remember you going back for Delaney when anyone sane would have run the other direction. He shifted in the bed, wincing slightly at the movement. But what I can't stop thinking about is what Gunnery Sergeant Ortega told me this morning. About who you really are. The Angel of Kandahar. The combat medic who held a defensive position for 7 hours while treating 47 wounded soldiers. who personally killed 11 enemy combatants while performing emergency surgery, who refused extraction until every man under her care was evacuated. Cross's voice dropped. I've been in the military for 20 years, Lieutenant. I thought I understood courage. But what you did in Kandahar, what you did yesterday, that's something else entirely. That's the kind of heroism that changes the definition of what's possible. Kira felt uncomfortable under his intense gaze. I was just doing my job, sir. Same as you do yours. No, Cross said firmly. What you did goes far beyond duty. And I need you to understand something. When the inquiry happens, when they ask me what I witnessed, I'm going to tell them everything. About your speed, your strength, your decision-making under impossible pressure. I'm going to tell them that you're the finest combat medic I've ever seen, and that this military would be making a catastrophic mistake if they let you languish in a routine posting. Sir, with respect, I came here specifically to avoid that kind of attention, Kira said. I know, Cross replied, and I understand why. But Lieutenant, yesterday I saw something in you that I don't think you see yourself. When that helicopter was falling, when you were running towards certain death, you weren't the broken veteran trying to hide from her past. You were fully alive, completely in your element, doing exactly what you were meant to do. That doesn't mean it's what I want to do, Kira said quietly. Maybe not, Cross allowed, but it's who you are, and I don't think you can run from that forever. Before Kira could respond, there was a commotion outside Cross's room. Raised voices, the sound of multiple people moving quickly. Then Captain Reeves appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with urgency. Lieutenant Brennan, we have an emergency. Multi-vehicle accident on the highway outside the base. At least 15 casualties incoming, several critical. Every available medical officer is being called in. Kira was on her feet instantly, all thoughts of their conversation forgotten. What's the ETA on the casualties? First ambulance is 3 minutes out, Reeves said. We're setting up a triage area in the main emergency bay. But Lieutenant, she hesitated, we're short-staffed today. 2 of our senior surgeons are off base at a conference. We're going to be overwhelmed. Then we work with what we have, Kira said, already moving toward the door. She paused and looked back across. Excuse me, sir. Go, Cross said. And Lieutenant, he called after her, this is who you are. Don't fight it. The emergency bay was controlled chaos by the time Kira arrived. Corpsmen were setting up treatment stations, laying out supplies, preparing for the incoming wave of casualties. She could hear sirens in the distance, growing louder with each second. Captain Reeves appeared at her side, clipboard in hand. We've got reports of at least 5 critical injuries, she said. Major trauma, potential spinal injuries, severe burns from a vehicle fire. This is going to be bad, Lieutenant. Then we prioritize and move fast, Kira said, her voice calm despite the circumstances. She looked around at the assembled medical staff, saw fear and uncertainty on young faces. These were good people, well-trained, but most had never dealt with mass casualty situations. Listen up, Kira called out, and her voice carried the kind of authority that made everyone stop and focus on her. We have multiple critical casualties incoming. This is a mass casualty scenario, and we're going to handle it the way we've been trained. Triage first, stabilize second, definitive care third. Nobody dies because we panicked or made mistakes. Understood. A chorus of yes, ma'am, answered her. Private Osei was there, looking nervous but determined. She moved to Kira's side without being asked, ready to assist. The first ambulance arrived with a screech of brakes, and paramedics rushed in with a patient on a stretcher. Kira took one look and made her assessment in seconds. Male, mid-30s, severe head trauma, Glasgow coma scale of 6, immediate intubation required. She moved into action, her hands steady as she secured the airway, her voice clear as she gave orders to the surrounding staff. More casualties arrived, a flood of broken bodies that would have overwhelmed a less experienced team. But Kira moved between them with practiced efficiency, making rapid assessments, prioritizing treatment, directing resources where they were needed most. A young woman with severe burns, skin charred and peeling, screaming in agony. Kira got pain medication into her within seconds, her hands gentle despite the urgency, her voice soothing as she explained what she was doing. An elderly man with a steering column through his chest, impaled and barely conscious. Kira knew immediately that moving him wrong would kill him. She coordinated with the surgical team, supervised every step of the extraction, her knowledge of anatomy and trauma making the difference between success and tragedy. A child, maybe 7 years old, with internal injuries and fading fast. Kira worked on him with fierce concentration, refusing to accept that someone so young could die on her watch. She found the internal bleeding, controlled it, stabilized him, and personally accompanied him to the operating room. 90 minutes after the first casualty arrived, the emergency bay had processed 17 patients. 13 were stable and receiving definitive care. 3 were in surgery with good prognosis. 1 had died before reaching the hospital, beyond anyone's ability to save. Kira stood in the middle of the bay, her uniform soaked with blood, her face streaked with sweat, her body running on pure adrenaline and muscle memory. Around her, the medical staff worked with renewed confidence, having watched her handle the impossible and make it look routine. Captain Reeves approached, her expression one of awe. "Lieutenant," she struggled for words. "I've never seen anyone coordinate a mass casualty response with that level of skill. You saved lives today that we would have lost without your leadership." "Just doing my job, ma'am," Kira said, but the words fell hollow even as she spoke them. Because Cross had been right. In the middle of that chaos, directing treatment, making life-and-death decisions, using every skill she'd learned in 6 years of combat medicine, Kira had felt something she hadn't felt in 18 months. She'd felt whole. She'd felt like herself. And that realization terrified her more than any falling helicopter ever could. Private Osei appeared with water and a clean towel. "Ma'am, you should clean up. There are people waiting to see you." "Who?" Kira asked. "Everyone," Osei replied simply. Kira looked out through the emergency bay doors and saw what the young private meant. Marines had gathered outside, dozens of them, all waiting. When they saw her looking, they came to attention in a single unified movement. No one had ordered them there. They'd come on their own, drawn by news of the accident, staying to see if the Angel of Kandahar would prove herself once again. And she had. Kira cleaned up in the hospital locker room, washing away blood and sweat under water that ran cold then hot, watching the drain swirl red then clear. Her hands are steady now, the adrenaline crash still hours away. She'd learned long ago how to delay the breakdown, how to keep functioning until the crisis was truly over and she could afford to fall apart. When she emerged in a fresh uniform, she found Colonel Webb waiting in the hallway. His expression was grave, but not unkind, and he gestured for her to follow him to a private office. "I heard about the mass casualty response," Webb said once the door was closed. "Captain Reeves tells me you saved at least 4 lives that would have been lost without your intervention. She's recommending you for a commendation." "It was a team effort, sir," Kira replied automatically. Webb gave her a look that suggested he knew exactly how inadequate that response was. "Kira, we need to talk. Really talk. Not officer to officer, but human to human." He sat down and indicated she should do the same. "What happened in that emergency bay today, what happened with the helicopter yesterday, these aren't isolated incidents. This is who you are." "Sir, I came here to get away from that," Kira said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I know," Webb replied, "but I don't think you can. And more importantly, I don't think you should." He leaned forward. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about being tired, about wanting normal. I understand that. God knows I understand that. But Kira, what if hiding isn't healing? What if trying to be less than you are is what's actually breaking you?" The words hit harder than Kira expected. She looked away, focusing on a spot on the wall rather than meeting Webb's eyes. "I've seen it before," Webb continued gently. "Operators who try to step back, to become normal, to leave the intensity behind. And you know what happens? They wither. They lose themselves trying to find themselves. Because you can't go back to who you were before. You can only move forward as who you've become." "And what have I become?" Kira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone extraordinary," Webb said. "Someone with skills and experience that can save lives and train the next generation to save even more lives. Someone who, when the moment comes, runs toward danger instead of away from it, because that's what your body and soul have been shaped to do. Kira felt tears threatening and fought them back. But what about the cost, she said. What about the nightmares and the hypervigilance and the way I can't sit in a restaurant without mapping every exit? What about the Fortinine soldiers I couldn't save no matter how hard I tried? That's the price of service, Webb said. And it's not fair, and it's not easy, and it hurts like hell. But Kira, those Fortinine haunt you because you care enough to try. The 312 you saved, they're alive because you paid that price. Can you really tell me that if given the choice again, you'd choose to save yourself instead of them? No, Kira admitted. I'd make the same choices. Every single time. Then stop running from who that makes you, Webb said. The Angel of Kandahar isn't a burden to escape. She's the truest version of yourself. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Gunnery Sergeant Ortega entered, his face showing the kind of excitement that seemed unusual for a man of his experience and bearing. Sir, ma'am, you need to come outside, Ortega said. Something's happening. Webb and Kira exchanged glances and followed Ortega through the hospital corridors. As they approached the main entrance, Kira could hear voices, many voices, unified in some kind of chant or call. When they stepped outside, she stopped dead in her tracks. The parade ground in front of the hospital was filled with Marines. Not dozens anymore, but hundreds. What looked like the entire base complement had assembled in formation, standing at attention under the late afternoon sun. And as Kira appeared, a single voice called out a command. Present arms. 500 Marines saluted in perfect unison, the movement so synchronized it looked choreographed. But this wasn't a formal ceremony. This was spontaneous, organic, a gesture of respect that came from the heart rather than from orders. Staff Sergeant Donovan stood at the front of the formation. He executed an about-face and marched toward Kira with parade ground precision. When he reached her, he saluted again, holding it. Lieutenant Kira Brennan, he said, his voice carrying across the silent assembly. On behalf of every Marine on this base, we want to thank you for your service, for your sacrifice, for showing us what true courage looks like. We were blind, and you helped us see. We were ignorant, and you taught us through your actions. We are better Marines because of you. Behind him, Corporal Thorne stepped forward, along with Private Morrison, the other Marine Kira had saved from the helicopter crash. They both carried something between them, a wooden display case. Ma'am, Thorne said, his young face serious, we heard that your medals from Kandahar and your other deployments are in storage somewhere. That you didn't want them displayed, didn't want the attention they'd bring. We respect that choice. But we wanted you to have something to remember that we see you now. That we understand what you've done and what you continue to do. Morrison opened the case to reveal a custom-made plaque. Engraved on it were the words, Lieutenant Kira Brennan, the Angel of Kandahar. When others run from danger, she runs toward it. When others give up, she fights on. When others look away, she bears witness. Her courage saves lives. Her sacrifice inspires us all. Below the inscription were listed the dates of the helicopter rescue and the mass casualty response, along with one simple phrase. Our hero. Kira felt the tears she'd been fighting finally break through. They ran down her face unchecked as she took the plaque with trembling hands. She tried to speak, but couldn't find words adequate to the moment. Private Osei approached next, her eyes also wet with tears. Ma'am, she said softly, you told me that proving yourself never stops. That you wanted to be valued for what you were doing here, not for what you did in Kandahar. She gestured to the assembled Marines. You've done that. Every person here values you for what you do every single day. But now we also understand the depth of sacrifice and service that prepared you to do it. Colonel Webb stepped forward and cleared his throat. Lieutenant Brennan, I have something official to share. Based on yesterday's actions and confirmed by Lieutenant Commander Cross's testimony, you are being awarded your 4th Silver Star for extraordinary heroism in saving 2 lives at great personal risk. Additionally, Captain Reeves has recommended and I have approved your promotion to Captain, effective immediately. He pulled out the captain's bars from his pocket. Normally, we'd have a formal ceremony for this, but given the circumstances, I think we should do it now. Captain Kira Brennan, you have earned this rank through your actions, your leadership, and your unwavering commitment to saving lives. Congratulations. Webb pinned the new rank insignia on Kira's collar, while 500 Marines maintained their salute. When he finished, he stepped back and saluted her himself. But there was one more surprise. From the back of the formation, a wheelchair emerged, pushed by a hospital corpsman. In it sat Lieutenant Commander Cross, his legs still elevated, but his face determined. He'd insisted on being here, had refused to miss this moment. Captain Brennan, Cross called out, his voice carrying despite his weakened state. You saved my life. You went back into fire and death to pull me out. I will never forget that, and neither will anyone here. You are the finest example of what a Marine should be, and I am honored to have served with you. The assembled Marines began to clap, but then something else happened. One by one, starting with Donovan and spreading through the ranks, they began to lower their salutes and instead brought their fists to their hearts in the ancient gesture of brotherhood, a sign that said more than words ever could. You are one of us. You are valued. You are home. Kira stood before them, tears streaming freely now, holding the plaque that represented everything she'd tried to run from and everything she'd finally found. She looked at their faces, young and old, male and female, all of them seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. And in that moment, standing before 500 Marines who understood what she'd sacrificed and what she continued to give, Kira felt something shift deep inside. The Angel of Kandahar wasn't a ghost to be hidden away. She wasn't a burden or a source of shame. She was strength. She was purpose. She was the best version of herself, forged in fire and proven through service. Webb leaned close and whispered, "Welcome back, Captain. We've been waiting for you." 3 weeks had passed since the ceremony on the parade ground, and the base had settled into a new rhythm. Kira, now Captain Brennan, walked through the medical facility with purpose rather than the quiet anonymity she'd maintained for so long. Marines saluted her not out of obligation, but genuine respect, and she returned each one with equal sincerity. The promotion had come with new responsibilities. Colonel Webb had created a position specifically for her, Senior Combat Medicine Instructor. She would continue working at the base hospital, but would also lead advanced training for corpsmen and medics preparing for deployment. It was a compromise between her need for stability and the military's recognition of her exceptional skills. This morning, she stood in front of 20 young medical personnel who'd been selected for intensive combat training. Among them was Private Osei, who'd requested the assignment specifically to learn from Kira. The room was silent as they waited for her to begin. Combat medicine isn't about being the smartest person in the room, Kira said, her voice carrying clearly. It's not about having the most technical knowledge or the fastest hands, though those things help. Combat medicine is about making impossible decisions under conditions designed to break you, and then living with those decisions for the rest of your life. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Some of you will freeze the first time you see a traumatic injury. Some of you will panic when rounds are coming in and your patient is bleeding out and you can't remember your training. That's normal. That's human. The question isn't whether you'll be afraid. The question is what you'll do despite that fear. Kira walked between the rows of seated students, making eye contact with each one. I spent 6 years in special operations zones. I treated 312 wounded soldiers under fire. I lost Fortinine despite everything I tried. She stopped moving and faced them directly. Those Fortinine haunt me every single day. I could tell you their names, their faces, what they said before they died. That's the cost of this job. Private Osei raised her hand tentatively. Ma'am, how do you carry that? How do you keep going when the losses are so heavy? You carry it by remembering the 312 who lived, Kira replied. You carry it by knowing that every skill you master, every technique you perfect, might be the difference between someone's child coming home or not. You carry it because the alternative is letting fear win, and that dishonors everyone you couldn't save. She moved to a table covered with medical equipment and began demonstrating techniques, her hands steady and sure as she explained the procedures that had saved lives in the worst conditions imaginable. The students watched with rapt attention, absorbing every word, every movement. After the class ended, Corporal Thorne appeared at the door. He'd requested a transfer to medical training, wanting to become a combat corpsman himself. The cocky young Marine who'd mocked her months ago had been transformed by what he'd witnessed. "Ma'am, do you have a minute?" he asked. "Walk with me," Corporal Kira said. They moved through the base together, the late morning sun warm on their faces. Thorne seemed to struggle with what he wanted to say. "I've been thinking about that day," he finally began, "when the helicopter was falling and I was frozen. I've had nightmares about it, ma'am, about being that paralyzed, that useless." He looked at her. "How do I make sure I never freeze like that again?" "You don't," Kira said simply. "You can't guarantee you won't freeze. But you can train yourself to act anyway, to push through the paralysis. Fear is always there, Thorne. It never goes away. You just get better at working alongside it." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "The fact that you're here, that you want to learn how to save lives instead of just take them, that tells me you're already stronger than you were that day. Use that fear. Let it remind you why the training matters." Thorne nodded slowly. "Thank you, ma'am, for saving my life, and for showing me what real strength looks like." That evening, Kira sat in her quarters reviewing training materials when a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Staff Sergeant Donovan, holding a folder. "Captain," he said formally, "I have the final report on the helicopter incident. Thought you'd want to see it." Kira took the folder and scanned the contents. The investigation had concluded that a maintenance error had caused the transmission failure. New safety protocols were being implemented across all rotary wing aircraft. Changes that would prevent future accidents. Changes that had come at the cost of near tragedy. "Commander Cross is being released from the hospital tomorrow," Donovan said. "Full recovery expected. Sergeant Delaney, too. Both of them asked me to tell you that they'd like to see you before they transfer out." "I'll visit them tonight," Kira replied. Donovan hesitated, then spoke again. "Ma'am, I wanted you to know something. I've been recommending you for special recognition to every officer who'll listen. Not just for the helicopter rescue, but for what you've done for this base. You've changed the culture here, made people think about who they respect and why." "That wasn't my intention," Staff Sergeant Kira said. "Maybe not," Donovan replied. "But it's what happened anyway. You made us better by being yourself, even when we made that difficult. That's leadership, ma'am." After he left, Kira walked to the hospital to visit Cross and Delaney. She found them together in Cross's room, both men looking remarkably recovered given the severity of their injuries. "Captain Brennan," Cross said with genuine warmth, "we were just talking about you, specifically about whether you'd punch us if we try to thank you one more time." "I might," Kira said with a slight smile, "but I make sure the medical staff was nearby to treat the injuries." Delaney laughed, then winced at the pain from his healing ribs. "Ma'am, I wanted to tell you something. I've been a Marine for 8 years, and I thought I understood what courage meant. Then I watched you hold that bulkhead off me while the whole aircraft was about to explode. That changed my definition permanently." Cross nodded in agreement. "We're both being reassigned to training commands, and we're both going to tell your story to every Marine we encounter. Not to embarrass you, but because they need to know what's possible when someone refuses to accept that good people should die. If this story moved you, drop a comment about your favorite moment, or tell us about someone you know who showed unexpected heroism when it mattered most. We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences." Kira felt the familiar tightness in her throat, but managed to keep her voice steady. "Just keep serving, gentlemen. That's all any of us can do." She left the hospital as evening settled over the base and walked to the parade ground where, 3 weeks ago, 500 Marines had saluted her. The space was empty now, quiet under the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Captain Kira Brennan stood alone and thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the broken veteran trying to hide from her past to someone who'd finally accepted that her past and present were inseparable. The Angel of Kandahar wasn't a ghost anymore. She was simply Kira, doing the work she was meant to do, training others to save the lives she'd spent 6 years learning how to save. Her sleeves were rolled up now, scars and tattoos visible to anyone who looked. She no longer hid the marks of her service. They were part of her story, proof of survival, evidence of sacrifice. And more importantly, they were teaching tools, visual reminders to her students of the cost and purpose of combat medicine. Private Osei appeared beside her, moving quietly. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for today's class, for being honest about the cost of this work. A lot of instructors just focus on technique and never talk about the emotional toll." "The emotional toll is half the job," Kira replied. "If I can prepare you for that, you'll be better able to handle it when it comes." "Do you think I'll be good at this?" Osei asked. "Good enough to make a difference." Kira looked at the young woman and saw herself from years ago, full of questions and determination. "You're already good, Private. The training will make you better. But what matters most is that you care enough to ask that question. Caring keeps you sharp when everything else falls apart." They stood together in the gathering darkness, two women who'd chosen to serve, who'd accepted that sometimes the hardest battles were fought with medical equipment instead of weapons, with compassion instead of violence. In the distance, Kira could see lights coming on across the base, Marines settling in for another night, most of them never knowing how close they'd come to losing good people 3 weeks ago. But that was the nature of her work. The lives saved often went uncounted. The disasters prevented remained invisible. Tomorrow she'd teach another class. She'd demonstrate techniques that could mean the difference between life and death. She'd share hard-won knowledge with young corpsmen who needed to understand what they were signing up for. And she'd do it all as herself, completely and without apology. The Angel of Kandahar had finally come home, not to the war zones that had forged her, but to a place where her experience could light the way for others, where her scars could tell stories that needed telling, where her courage could inspire a new generation to run toward danger instead of away from it. Captain Kira Brennan smiled at the stars above and felt, perhaps for the first time since that terrible night 18 months ago, something approaching peace. Not the absence of pain or the erasure of memory, but the acceptance that her journey, with all its costs and triumphs, had brought her exactly where she needed to be. She was no longer hiding. She was no longer running. She was simply standing in the truth of who she was, and that truth was enough. The base fell quiet around her as night deepened, and somewhere in the darkness, 500 Marines slept easier knowing that the Angel of Kandahar stood watch, ready to save lives whenever the moment demanded it. And she always would be,